Finally.
It's getting downloaded.
It's impossible to do a history of art lecture without images. But so William is known to all of us, historian, writer of many, many acclaimed award-winning books, art historian. Forgotten Masters is the second art exhibition curated by William, due to open in December in London. And this,
2 days.
yeah, oh, fantastic. And this gorgeous edited volume comes with it. So without any further delay, now that we've finally got the slides, I give to you William Dalrymple.
It's downloading. It's downloading.
So it's downloading, so I'll talk to you until forgive me, I sent the PowerPoint yesterday and it's been mislaid. 2 anarchies turned up at this venue rather than a PowerPoint about the Forgotten Masters. Anyway, so this book, Forgotten Masters, is the catalogue of a show which is opening on Tuesday in England, which is the first show, the first major international show ever of what is commonly called company school painting, though it's not a phrase we use in this exhibition. When the company began to encroach upon India, seizing first Bengal, then Bihar, Orissa, and working its way around the rest of the subcontinent, as it squeezed the regional courts, the Mughal artists who'd previously worked for Nawabs and the Mughals and the different Maharajas and Rajas around India found employment with East India Company servants. Never the company itself. The company never used artists as an official body. But individual enthusiasts realized the value of the work done by these different artists and began commissioning work from them. Are we up now? Are we up and running? We can start. Brilliant. And the story, hang on. Those of you who attended my session about the anarchy will know the story of how the company, this multinational corporation, gradually took over India by violence, loot, plunder, and asset stripping. But alongside that story, there's also the story of the interaction and the collaboration. During the Raj, there was almost complete separation between the ruler and the ruled. But the East India Company was a very different affair. While it was in many ways more violent, more extractive, more venal than the Victorian Raj after 1858, the company was also collaborative. And there was a great deal more interaction between the company servants and the people of India. 1/3 of all company servants by the time of the 1780s onwards were either married to or living with Indian women. And characters like this, John Wombwell up here, was the result. These white moguls, British men who were cohabiting with Indian women, wearing Indian clothes, speaking Indian languages, producing Anglo-Indian children who often lived lives between 2 different religions. The Gardeners, for example, gave all their families, the Gardeners he was an American, born on the banks of the Hudson, who died on the banks of the Ganges. He married a Begum of Cambay, and his wife was Shia Muslim, and all their children had both Christian and Muslim names. And so some of them had both. So James Jahangir Shiko Gardiner, for example. And in the Skinner family, they used to give them sort of separate sets. So what was the Hercules Skinner, who was one of the children of James Skinner, also was known as Shiko Skinner. And so they had these double identities. And you find that just as the company was reliant on Indian capital in order to pay for their armies and to finance their wars, so there was far greater interaction in almost every sphere of life, not only social and sexual, but also artistic, cultural. Someone like William Fraser coming to live in Delhi, immediately became a friend of Ghalib, commissioned many of Ghalib's greatest ghazals. When he was killed, Ghalib said he felt like he was losing a father a second time. And so you get a degree of interaction which was infinitely closer at this period than was the case in the Victorian Raj, when you get the civil lines, people moving outside the Indian cities, when you get the cantonments into which no military person can go. The beginning of the story of artistic interaction happens very early on in about the 1660s in Madras, when you get company servants employing Mughal-trained artists to paint things for them. But initially, the painting is done in a full Mughal style. What's interesting is what happens in Lucknow and Patna, then later Calcutta, Delhi, and various other stations like Vellore and Tanjore, when you start having company officials commissioning Mughal painters to paint in a hybrid style, in a style which is both European and Mughal. And arguably, just to continue here, this is Wombwell with his... Hang on, we're having another technical problem here. Could I have a technician? Oh, you've got it, here we are. Got it, here we are. So in Lucknow, you have an existing artistic world where the Nawabs are generous patrons, both of poets and of painters. And many of the greatest Delhi painters fleeing the carnage in Delhi, where Marathas and Afghans are both competing to loot the city. You have this exodus of the artistic talent. So in poetry, Mir goes to Lucknow, where he constantly feels out of place. But in art, too, Dip Chand, who's one of the great Delhi artists, makes his way to Delhi. And he begins to paint this hybrid world. And if you look at this picture, this is actually, it's less obviously strange than the idea of a white Englishman, a Yorkshire chartered accountant wearing Mughal jama. But if you look carefully at Ashraf Ali Khan, this is a Kashmiri merchant who'd cornered the saltpeter trade in Patna. He is sitting cross-legged on a British chair. And his hookah is resting on a Georgian teapoy, one of those three-legged stands to his right. You can see his duties at the bottom of his chair, and he's sitting cross-legged. His mistress, Mutabi, is likewise sitting on amid Georgian furniture. Today, this doesn't surprise us as much as the Brits in Indian dress, but at the time, this is as revolutionary a crossing of culture. This is the beginning of Western influence seeping into the way people are living. And this is being recorded by Mughal artists working sometimes for company patrons. And this is the sort of person we're talking about. This is Mazhar Ali Khan, sitting in a Delhi Haveli, probably around 1825. And if you look, he's sitting in the Mughal painting position, which is sitting on the floor with your back against a bolster with one leg raised. That's how any of the great Mughal artists would have paid, whether it's Mansoor or Bichita or any of the great artists of the Mughal court. But things are changing. For a start, he's wearing glasses, which are spectacles, which are a Western introduction. And if you look carefully at the artistic instruments that he has in front of him, there are both Mughal oyster shells containing ground mineral pigments, which was the Mughal way of painting, and English watercolor kits, which were new imported arrivals. And if you look carefully at the brushes, he has both Mughal brushes with single squirrel hairs and Western paintbrushes. So the artists are, like any of us do today, taking what's best for us for what we want to do, not particularly thinking about the nationality of any cultural form or any object. This is another portrait of one of the great artists of the period, previously unpublished, called Yelapa of Vellore. And presumably he's painting it into a mirror. His assistant to the right is holding the album this image is still contained within. That album is intact, it hasn't been broken, and we will be displaying it in that album next week. But again, if you look carefully at the way Yelapa is painting, He's got both Western watercolors. See if we can get, here we are. You can see there's Western watercolors. Oh dear. And the oyster shells, which contain the Mughal pigments. And it's an incredibly knowing self-portrait. This is a confident artist looking directly at the picture, but it's a warts and all portrait. If you look close up, you can see all his smallpox marks and various other disfigurements. So the story of Mughal artists altering their styles to paint in a hybrid style begins, I think, probably in Lucknow with Claude Martin. Claude Martin's great friend, Antoine Paulier, who was a Swiss engineer, had been using Dipchand and many of the other Lucknow artists to paint conventional Mughal paintings. Claude Martin imported to his house in Lucknow a Western library and was very much in touch with the philosophers and the artists and the intellectual currents in Paris, France, and Britain. And so within 10 years of the Montgolfier brothers raising a hot air balloon in Paris, Claude Martin, using reports in scientific journals, has built his own one in Lucknow and raised up in the air and gone up. And at this period, about 1760, 1770, there is a new passion in Europe for botany and natural history. It begins with Linnaeus in Sweden, naming plants. Up to this point, plants have been named rather randomly by individual botanists. There was no set system of naming. Linnaeus came up with a system, what's called the sexual system of classification, based on the number of stamen that a plant has. And he would give a plant two names, a genus name and a specific name, just like with a human being having a first name and a family name. And this caught on, and a rapid fashion for botany spread from Sweden to Britain and Paris. And there was this sudden, particularly in Britain and in France, this sudden passion for publishing extremely expensive books of lithographs of natural history, of mammals, of botany, of plants. And the style chosen was often against a white background, with sometimes a cross-section of the plant. And we know from his will that Claude Martin imported in the 1770s a book from France, a 3-volume book of the birds of France, illustrated in this fashion. And the assumption is that he must have had this shown to Dipchand and the Lucknow atelier, because very quickly, from Claude Martin's riverside house in the center of Lucknow, which is on the left in this picture, he begins to commission entirely new sorts of paintings. This is the world we're talking about. Claude Martin is sitting there with his friends. This is Paulier, who's been employing Mughal artists for the last 20 years. This is Wombwell, the guy we last saw wearing the Mughal jama, to his right. And they're looking at pictures. Zoffany is painting a self-portrait at the back. There are more Zoffany pictures hung in the rear. And this world where scientific journals, imported natural history books, Indian artists are all mixing in this strange artistic intellectual milieu begins to produce this sort of thing. And this is an early Claude Martin image of a falcon. And you can see the same profile, detailed painting of the bird's plumage that you might find in a Mansour picture from the age of Jahangir, 120 years earlier. But in this case, the bird is shown against a white background in this white sort of pseudo-scientific style. Here is a more hybrid example where you have one of these miniature Lucknowi landscapes stretching out in the distance with these sort of Lilliput trees underneath it. This is an adjutant stalk. And this seems to have been commissioned, a set of bird pictures seems to have been commissioned around 1770 by Claude Martin. He also commissioned snakes, and later, about 10 years later, commissioned a series of around 1,000 natural history pictures, which have just turned up last year in Kew. They got lost and no one knew there, and a researcher called Henry Nolte, who was working for this exhibition, found 1,000 unaccessioned, unpublished Claude Martin masterpieces of this quality sitting in Kew. Incidentally, in the Kew Herbarium, they classify their natural history pictures by genus. So in order to find the Indian pictures, you have to go through all the water lily pictures, then through all the palms, then through all the ferns, and so on. And Henry has found 1,000 Lucknow 1770 to 1790 natural history pictures commissioned in this hybrid world, preceding any other company paintings. None of them have ever been published before, and they go on show on Tuesday for the first time in London. So at the same time as all this is going on in Lucknow, a little bit later, maybe 2 or 3 or maybe 5 years later, Claude Martin's friends and contemporaries and rivals in Calcutta catch on to this fad. And this is the earliest example we have. I've written here 1780, but I think we're now, in the published version, we've gone for about 1775 for this picture. And it was commissioned by a man called James Kerr, who was the first supervisor of the Sibpur Botanic Gardens in Calcutta. He was a friend of Claude Martin, and this may be the first of the Calcutta natural history paintings. A whole set of these survive in Calcutta still, but they are very difficult to get access to, and the Botanic Gardens don't make them available to scholars. But the ones which got sent back to Edinburgh, because Kerr was a Scotsman and made copies of his favourite pictures and had them sent back to Edinburgh, these ones will be on show in the day. And by the late 1780s, you're getting about 10 or 15 major Mughal artists who've been trained to paint Durbar scenes, trained to paint Nawabs and Mughals and so on, turning their skills to this new market of botanists and botany. And the examples are extraordinary. This picture with these sort of strange cross-sections and root systems, you have the impression that the artist himself is looking at something that's very strange to him. And it's rather like a sort of alien species. This is Vishnu Prasad. Always behind all these ventures, you always got to remember that the company is a commercial organization. So many of the plants, and the ones that are given most prominence, are commercial plants. So coffee, opium, and plants that the company thought it might be able to make into an export trade. But the beauty of these things are extraordinary. Here is, a picture of a poppy, and you can see it's a poppy in decay. You've got one seed head heavy now with opium. Then you've got on the right of this picture 3 little cross sections. Other artists like Munna Lal paints with a single squirrel hair brush. So you have this incredible detail in the root systems, and every single piece of the moss is recorded. This is Munna Lal again. We think Munna Lal was probably a Murshidabad artist who migrated with Mir Qasim to Patna, and then was summoned by the botanists from Patna down to Calcutta. And the detail of this pitcher plant, it reminds me of some of those Robert Mapplethorpe images of orchids. This is ginger. In the south, the botanists didn't have Mughal court artists to fall back on. So what do you do if you haven't got this group of artists who are trained to paint in this incredibly detailed fashion? The answer is you go to other artists. Who is there in the south? There are chintz painters. So Rangia, who's working for the botanists based in Andhra Pradesh, up from Machilipatnam and north of Madras and inland from Hyderabad, seems to have employed a family of chintz painters and kalamkari painters. And as you can see in this picture, there's none of the volume and none of the perspective that you get with the Mughal artists. It's a completely flat picture. But Rangia has taken these tendrils on a dance. He's used to filling the spaces. So while the main focus of the attention is the leaf systems, the tendrils, he does what he would have done with a kalamkari painting, which is to fill the blank space with scrollage. Vishnu Prasad is another of the most prolific artists. He seems to have started on the Andhra coast and then later been employed by Nathaniel Wallach in another Scots supervisor of the Sibpur Botanic Gardens. in Calcutta. And again, they're paintings of incredible delicacy and beauty. This is from an album commissioned by a man called Nathaniel Rind, who was an army major, and he had a great interest in botany. And these paintings were bought by V.S. Naipaul and are now in the exhibition. This is more from the Rind album. But the real breakthrough came with the arrival in 1777 of this woman, Lady Mary Impey. And Mary Impey was a 22-year-old who had grown up in Oxfordshire. Her husband was Sir Elijah Impey, who was the Supreme Court judge. And he immediately got caught up in the politics of Warren Hastings' period, and was absent from the house most of the time, fighting with Philip Francis and intriguing with Hastings, leaving his wife alone and having to fall back on her own resources. And she, as a child, had been fascinated by botany in Oxfordshire and kept a nature journal. But when she came to Calcutta, she was able to employ the very greatest Mughal artists. And she called from Patna 3 great Mughal artists, Sheikh Zainuddin, Ramdas, and Bhawani Das. These are her children running around upstairs. And the images painted for Impey in the Impey albums are now regarded as some of the great masterpieces of this genre. And individual examples in the sale rooms these days sell for about £250,000, about $500,000. Yet amazingly, museums have been very slow to react to this, and we've never seen a museum show of the Impey pictures until now. The first season of work that these artists did for Mary Impey was to paint her private menagerie, her private zoo that was in the grounds. And they're large mammals. They're cheetahs, sambas, pangolins. This is looking incredibly sort of Disney-like, this creature. A Malabar giant squirrel. Again, you see fragments of that old Lucknow world of the miniature Lilliputian landscape in the background. And yet you've got the very European innovation of a cross-section of the nut that the squirrel is eating on the right. There are incredible images of storks. The storks, these are about 6 feet tall. They're life-size. Huge and gorgeous images. Rather Japanese in feeling, I think. But very much channeling the work of Mansour 200 years earlier. But rather than the paradise landscapes which surrounds the zebras and the turkeys of Mansour, here you have a simple white background. This used to belong to Jackie Kennedy, and it's a stork eating a snail. Pelican. And then you have whole sort of natural history stories, rather like a sort of 18th century equivalent of a David Attenborough natural history program. And you've got silk cocoons hanging from a branch on the right. You have then the caterpillar hatching, turning into a moth, and then presumably being eaten by the bird. There's a whole sort of circuit of narrative going on in some of these pictures. This picture always makes me wonder whether they were painting from life or, like Aubadon later in the United States, were painting from dead creatures. Is this Indian roller preening its wing in this manner, or is it actually a sort of, is that the shape it ended up in rigor mortis? So much about this painting, in a sense, sums up this story. You've got this perfect image of a black hooded oriole, and at first sight it could be a European natural history painting. But no European artist would risk that colour of the bird, that richness of that yellow, or to make the bark of the tree, not the bark of the tree, the centre of the tree chime with that colour. And then there are moments of great flatness. You can barely see it, but there is a sort of a grasshopper here, which is completely flat, as if he's forgotten how to do perspective suddenly. This thing looks as if it should be attached to Sigourney Weaver's face, but it's not an outtake from Alien. This is a horseshoe crab painted by Sheikh Zainuddin. the snakes. As the seasons ran on, they ran out of pictures to paint in the menagerie, and they began to paint insects and fish of Bengal. And Bhawani Das got given the insects and the reptiles. This is the male fruit bat, very male, as you can see. And he's got his arm outstretched as if he's some sort of Venetian commendatore about to usher a lady into an opera house or something. You never almost forget that he's a creature in a colonial menagerie. This is his girlfriend. And this is his mother-in-law. We have lizards, catfish, pufferfish, mango fish. And this is a very strange flat river fish. I love the kind of slightly weird expression on the face up here. Just 1, 2 eyes and a mouth. Then you began to get specialists who clearly trained up specifically to paint colonial menageries for the company. And this is an artist called Haludar, who worked in this very specific style of pen and ink. And he was employed by a colonial official called Francis Buchanan, working in the Barrackpore menagerie of Lord Wellesley. We don't know his work, any work of his beyond this natural history painting, but he had this very detailed style. Sometimes he uses a little bit of watercolor wash. But I love this one. It looks as if the poor bear has been given an electric shock. All his hairs are sort of standing on end, alive with static. And once this had caught on, other artists looking for work began to set up shop. And one of the most successful was this character, Sheikh Mohammed Amir. He was a freelance. He had a studio in Calcutta, and he seems to have gone from door to door offering his work to colonial households. And you get little hints of I don't know whether it's anti-colonial resistance or anti-colonial complication, but why is the girl, the colonial daughter in this picture, the only one not to be shown with her face? The servants are given full humanity, you can see their character, their open faces, but the English girl is entirely absent inside her bonnet. Now you can interpret that in various ways. Is that a Muslim showing respect by not showing a woman's face? Is it, or perhaps colonial respect up to your patron's daughter, you're not showing her? Or is it somehow just regarding her as not quite a human being, that there's some sort of form of resistance going on here with the artist, that they don't want to show the child as a human being at all. She's just a creature in a bonnet. Sheikh Mohammed Amir clearly had seen Stubbs-style horsey paintings. He also specialized in other creatures in colonial households, such as dogs. These two are both given names. One is called General and the other is called Aya. He painted carriages. In this picture, you can feel the heat of perhaps a monsoon Calcutta day with the clouds growing in the morning. And you've got a stalk on the right and the perfect reflection of the house in the middle. And so this fashion passed from Lucknow to Calcutta and from Calcutta to Agra and Delhi. And of course, in Agra and Delhi, you've still got large households of Mughal-trained artists. In Agra, you get the descendants of the stonemasons setting up shop, painting perfect frontal images of the Taj and the other buildings of Agra, the Agra fort and so on, and Fatehpur Sikri, for passing travellers. And we know a little about them. Fanny Parks, the travel writer in the 1820s, interviews Sheikh Latif, and he says that he's a direct descendant of the masons who made Salim Chisti's mausoleum. Here we have this incredibly fine image of the Fatehpur Sikri mausoleum with these beautifully delineated jali screens. So light, you feel you could sort of blow it away with a breath. Here's the Khas Mahal in Agra Fort, the Jat Palace in Deeg. And then in Delhi, you've got the family of Ghulam Ali Khan. Now, Ghulam Ali Khan seems to have been a descendant of Mansur. He proudly calls himself palace-born in one inscription. In other words, he was born in the Red Fort, was part of the imperial household. And his family begin to work not just for the Emperor Zafar, but also for the nobles of the court, like Nawab Judger and James Skinner, but particularly for William Fraser and James Fraser. And it's these artists, like Ghulam Ali Khan, who paint the most successful of all these colonial commissions, the Fraser album. This is a picture of Skinner's church, still there in Kashmiri Gate. You also see the entrance to James Skinner's Haveli, which is no longer there, except for the mosque, which was part of the Haveli, but precedes it. And then you have William Fraser's house, just hidden behind here on this side, and William Fraser's new grave, which means that this painting must have been painted after 1835 when he died. This is the interior of St. James' Church. When I was researching The Last Mughal, I was using the palace intelligence documents in the National Archives. And there you have two very interesting references to Ghulam Ali Khan and his nephew Mazhar Ali Khan. Ghulam Ali Khan at one point is said by Zafar to be ordered to draw a sketch of a hunting lodge, a plan for a hunting lodge, which Zafar wanted to erect near Sultan Gari in Maroli. So Ghulam Ali Khan seems to have worked both as an architectural painter and painting buildings like St. James' Church, but also as an architectural draftsman drawing out plans for building them. So he had a double life. While Mazhar Ali Khan, we have a direct reference. Now, Mazhar Ali Khan did the great Delhi Panorama and the Delhi album, which is now in the British Library. But in the Palace Intelligence, there's a crucial quote where Zafar tells Mazhar Ali Khan to keep quiet because he's being rude about the British resident. And this is Thomas Metcalfe, who employed him for his tomb. Whether Metcalfe didn't pay him or treated him badly, but we have a direct reference to these guys, far from being sort of patient servants, showing strong resistance. What's interesting about Ghulam Ali Khan is that he doesn't alter his style when painting for the court or painting for Mughal grandees like Nawab Abdul Rahman Khan of Judger. This image of Nawab Judger riding on his tiger, as one does of an afternoon, is very much in the same style as the work he did for Skinner and for Fraser, which is why we resist this title company painting, because certainly in the Delhi's context, it makes no sense, because these same artists are painting the same style for Mughals, half Indians like Anglo-Indians like James Skinner, and the colonial establishment like William Fraser. Mazhar Ali Khan, working for Skinner, paints the different castes of Delhi with the Tazkirat al-Umrah. This is the kind of Keith Richards of Mughal Delhi, Ustad Himat Khan, who got banished from Delhi for impregnating one of Zafar's concubines with very good timing in 1856, which meant he was exiled to Hyderabad and survived the uprising and the aftermath, which wiped out the rest of the Delhi Gharana. And so he comes back afterwards and keeps the school going. Lots of pictures of dancing girls. I don't think this is sort of colonial Orientalism, really, because this was a central part of Mughal Delhi's self-image. The courtesans and the whole culture of the Chowri Bazaar and the Tawaif culture of Old Delhi was central to the existence of the old court, of the old fort, and all the Mughal princes would leave, if they had permission to leave the fort, would leave after about 9 o'clock and head to the Chowri Bazaar, where the mushairas would take place, often in the kotis of the courtesans. And these were women of high status. The Fraser album particularly concentrates on the household of William Fraser. And this is a before and after picture of his main ADC and bodyguard, Kala, who saved William Fraser's life by killing a tiger with his sword, which was a very foolhardy and dangerous thing to do. Normally you used a gun or a spear when tiger hunting in this period. And when Fraser is attacked by a tiger, Kala leaps on it with his sword and kills the tiger. And in the Fraser album, he's got a before and after shot. This is the same guy. On the left, we have him as he appeared out of his Haryanvi village in his rather dirty, dhoti and disheveled turban. And on the right, we've got him after a blow dry and a haircut and a bit of a bath and a hammam session. And he's wearing this rather nice sort of neo-Napoleonic outfit. He's got a kind of Shaveite hat. There is a Shaveite half moon and tiger skin. I don't know quite what's going on there. This sort of rather Napoleonic middle. And there on the crossband is the Fraser Heart's Head, which is the family crest, with Je suis preste. I'm always ready on it. But an incredibly elegant pair of portraits. They're quite big, these. These are about 4 feet, 5 feet long. You get the celebrity holy men, the I don't know, the Babu Ramdevs of their day, perhaps, the god men. This guy didn't start an Ayurvedic chain, but he's shown here sitting outside Turkman Gate. Other characters who join Skinner's horse in this very dashing out. You can see the tiger skin hats very clearly there of the Skinner's horse. This character looks like sort of Flashman coming out of some novel. And these incredible portraits of these Haryanvi villagers on their way to become part of Skinner's horse. And you see them before and after, in their dhotis, in the villages. And this, of course, is the first time in Indian art that we get to see ordinary villagers. In Mughal court scenes, we get to see the Omras, we get to see the Nawabs, we get to see the grandees. Occasionally, we get to see their wives. But we never get to see ordinary villagers. And many of the Fraser images are of these characters coming out of fields with their spears. This is the 18th century when every man is armed. Everyone is both farmer and soldier, protecting their families. But you also get the princely class. This is the princes of Patiala. You get Afghan mercenaries coming down and selling their military services, the military labor market on the streets of Delhi. And this character, one from the left, looking like a sort of pirate out of Pirates of the Caribbean. He's got about 6 swords in his crossband, a rocket, a musket. He's got I don't know what he's got coming behind him. Is that a bow? A bow, I think, hanging from his back. So all these are the characters who Fraser interacted with. And we also get to see Fraser's own family, because William Fraser had a girlfriend outside Hisar, and this is her. She's got Amiban, and this is Fraser's daughter by her, and this is his father-in-law and his bearded mother-in-law. Again, images of individual villagers. These are not stock images. Each has got a number and a name. So these are portraits of the village elders. And on the ground on the right, we've got their land receipts. So this is the first British land survey for tax purposes of Haryana. And everyone's brought their documents to land holdings to prove how much land they own, and they're going to be taxed accordingly. So this is not a neutral picture. This is very much part of the colonial world. This is people in the process of entering the colonial tax net, if you like. And yet, this is the first time we meet these people. And obviously, it was important for Fraser to know who these elders were. Each one of them is given a name. It's rather like headmasters of a school getting pictures of their pupils at the beginning of a year so they can learn the names of the people they'll have to deal with. Fraser's other work was working with horses, importing horses from Afghanistan. He went on the Elphinstone mission in 1809, the first company expedition to Afghanistan, and he gathered a lot of contacts in Afghanistan, and then made a fortune with James Skinner and Ghalib's uncle. The three of them started business together, and they started a stud at a place called Dauna outside Hisar, and used to sell their horses both to Indian noblemen in North India and to the company. And every winter, the Afghans would come down from Afghanistan with their horses. There's a very good book being written currently by a young scholar at Ashoka on this trade. She can talk about it afterwards. More Patiala noblemen. And then gradually, by the end of the period, by 1830, you're seeing that individual artists are realizing that the more they make their work like European work, the higher they will be paid. And the first person to realize this seems to be this artist, Sitaram. Trained in the Murshidabad school, his early work is very Murshidabad. And he paints in this unbroken Murshidabad style. But by the time he's taken by Lord Hastings on Hastings' expedition in the 1820s upriver. He's beginning to paint. He's obviously looked at the Hodges and the Daniels, and he's begun this process of altering his Indian training to try and look like Western artists. And this is, in a sense, the fatal moment when it ceases to be Indian art and begins to become what we get in the Victorian period, with John Lockwood Kipling setting up the Lahore Art School and all the other colonial art schools in Bombay and so on, whereby traditional Indian painting goes under as colonial art is taught to be the only way to paint. And so with the advent of photography in the 1840s and 1850s and the advent of the colonial art schools in the 1860s, by the 1870s, the miniature tradition, the traditional Indian painting styles have been lost. There's only a few places it survives, in individual towns in Rajasthan, in the uncolonized princely states. These traditions do survive. And you find in places like Bawalpur the tradition continuing and then giving birth to the Lahore Art School in the 1970s and 80s. So there is an unbroken tradition in some places. But what you see happening with Sita Ram, with him trying to imitate the picturesque, is the beginning of the end. With Sita Ram's final picture, where he seems to be channeling Turner, with this incredible display of fireworks around the lake at La Martiniere, Claude Martin's obelisk coming up with the scaffolding still around it in the middle of the lake, seems to be the end of this story. So I'm just going to... Have we got any time for a little chit-chat?
Sadly, it's the end of our story as well. We've run out of time because of the technical...
Well, apologies for the technical difficulties. It's very difficult, as you can see, to give a talk like this without a PowerPoint. But anyway, it has arrived. So thank you, the technician, for rescuing the situation, albeit belatedly. Thank you. I'll be signing books outside to ask any more questions.